Hello everybody, and welcome to another presentation of the Elder Scrolls lore. Now that the gods and the universe of the Elder Scrolls have been established, we can start delving into the realms of recorded history. Before we get into this stuff I really want to talk about, such as particular figures and events throughout Tamriel's history, there's more that needs to be set up. That is the racial and cultural makeup of Tamriel itself, and how it got that way. Once again, I'm going to have to gloss over quite a bit here. There are a lot of very important and very interesting events which took place in order to shape Tamriel into the land we're familiar with in the games. I fully intend to cover some of them individually and in detail in the future. Now, let's get to it. The first inhabitants of Tamriel were its aboriginal natives, commonly referred to as beast folk. Most notable of Tamriel's natives are the Argonians, native of Blackmarsh, and the Khajiit, native of elsewhere. But also included are the goblins, the Reeklings found on the island of Solstheim, the giants of Skyrim and High Rock, the Hist, sentient trees of Blackmarsh, the nymphs, the Imga, or great apes of Valenwood, the aquatic and terrifying looking Dray, and the Lilmothit, a supposed fox-like race also native to Blackmarsh, thought to be extinct. There are plenty of other beastfolk on Nirn, like the Slode and the Sayesi, who will serve a role in Tamriel's history, but these are the main native ones, so we'll stop there for now. The first non-native species to arrive on Tamriel were the Aldmer, direct descendants of the Elnafey, who emigrated en masse from the continent of Aldmeris, which pulled in Atlantis and disappeared forever into the sea, so it may not have even existed in the first place. If it did, it was likely to the south of Tamriel. The Aldmer landed on the Somerset Isles and established a thriving kingdom. Most of the Aldmer would stay on Somerset and become known as the Altmer, also called High Elves, but not all of them. Some left to explore Tamriel. One group traveled to Valenwood and evolved into the Bosmer, or Wood Elves. Another group went up the Niben River, settling on the islands of Lake Rumer, building the White Gold Tower, and becoming the Aelids. Another group went as far from Somerset as possible, sailing around to Morrowind, then settling there and becoming the Chimer. According to the Chimer, the Dwemer, also called Deep Elves or Dwarves, were already settled in Morrowind when they arrived, making the origins of the Dwemer a source of speculation. The origins of the Falmer, or Snow Elves, who settled in Skyrim, is also lacking a direct explanation in Aldmer history, which is partly why this version of history, written by the Altmer, isn't accepted by everyone. First of all, the idea of the lost continent of Aldmeris is largely dismissed. Instead, the Somerset Isles are considered by many historians to be the birthplace of the Aldmer, which seems to make a little more sense. Also, the presence of the Dwemer and the Falmer so far from Somerset suggests that not all Mer originated from one place, but were multiple distinct cultures before arriving on Tamriel, and came from multiple locations. The Aldmer that left Somerset for Valenwood and those that went up the Niben did so as an extension of the Aldmeri Empire, thereby expanding their territory. The Aldmer that set sail for Morrowind, however, did so under the leadership of the prophet Veloth, and sought independence. Some of the Aldmer did not appreciate this, and didn't let them go without resistance. The group of Aldmer who set out to stop them was led by Trinimac, a lesser Aldmeri god, whose most notable role was as the champion of Auriel, and was the one who actually removed Lorkhan's heart. Trinimac and his followers attempted to stop Veloth and his flock from leaving, but were unsuccessful when Trinimac was confronted and subsequently eaten by Boethia, the Daedric prince of deceit, corruption, and treachery. Trinimac's body and soul were irreparably corrupted. Upon being expunged, he emerged as Malakath, the Daedric prince of curses and the betrayed. The exact details aren't clear, but Trinimac's corruption extended to his followers, who were transformed into the Orsimer, also known as Orcs. The early Orsimer lived independently, forming small, tight-knit villages and strongholds throughout Tamriel, mainly located within High Rock and Skyrim. Later, the city of Orsinium would be founded in the Hrothgarian mountains of High Rock. As word spread across Tamriel about the new rising civilization of orcs, many other orcs throughout the continent would relocate to Orsinium, eventually developing it into a powerful city-state. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The rise and fall of Orsinium is another story for another time. The first humans to arrive on Tamriel were the Needs, who were not one unified race. They were multiple pre-literate tribes who came independently in small groups from Atmora to the north of Tamriel, settling throughout High Rock, Hammerfell, Cyrodiil, Skyrim, and Morrowind. For the most part, initial relations between Needs and Mare were peaceful. The first organized human settlement of Tamriel came much later and was by a group of Atmorans who were fleeing a civil war. They settled in Skyrim, befriended the local snow elves, and built the city of Sarthal. Feelings between the two races were good for a while, until the snow elves were intimidated by how quickly the Atmorans were reproducing. Seeing a future competition for the land of Skyrim and fearing that their culture would be overtaken, the snow elves struck first, sacking Sarthal and slaughtering the inhabitants in an event later known as the Night of Tears. All the Atmorans were killed except for one man, Ysgramor, and his two sons. The three of them returned to Atmora and found that the civil war there had ended. They told the story of how the elves ruthlessly betrayed them and mercilessly killed almost everyone. In no time at all, Ysgramor had an army, later referred to in legend as the 500 Companions. To make a long story short, Ysgramor reclaimed Sarthal and made the snow elves scatter. The disjointed snow elves were eventually enslaved by the Dwemer and forced to go underground, in time becoming the degenerate modern-day Falmer. At this point, the snow elves were all but extinct. Following their campaign, Ysgramor and the remains of his army ventured out and spread across the continent. Those who stayed in Skyrim interbred with the local Needs and became the ancestors of the Nords. Those who found their way to High Rock also interbred with the Needs there, who in turn were assimilated into the Dureni clan, the dominant Aldmeri culture in the area. This intermingling gave birth to the Bretons. The Atmorans who made their way south were captured and enslaved by the Aelids and interbred with the likewise enslaved Needs during their captivity. To make another long story short, their descendants under the leadership of the slave queen Alessia would overthrow the Aelids and begin the line of ancestry leading to modern-day Imperials. The Nords quickly formed an empire in Skyrim and expanded into Morrowind, forcing the Chimer and Dwemer under their rule. Now, the Chimer and Dwemer were never very friendly with each other, mainly due to religious differences. However, the Nords were a common enemy. So while Skyrim was in the middle of an internal war of succession, a tenuous alliance between the Chimer and the Dwemer was formed. They struck hard and fast at the Battle of Red Mountain and were victorious, forcing the Nords out of Morrowind. Fast forward 300 years and the Dwemer, while mining under Red Mountain, discover the heart of Lorkhan and plan to use it to build a new god. Seeing this as a mockery to the gods and an affront to their beliefs, the Chimer go to war, despite the attempts of diplomacy by their king, Indoril Nerevar. The War of the First Council culminated at the Second Battle of Red Mountain. The Dwemer were drawn out and defeated. Kagrenak, the chief tonal architect of the Dwemer, basically the lead designer on Project New God, turned his tools on the heart of Lorkhan, and the entire Dwemer race across the entire continent spontaneously disappeared. Nerevar then made his generals swear an oath to Azura, the Daedric Prince of Dusk and Dawn, to never use the heart. To make another long story short, Vivek, Almalexia, and Sothasil broke their oaths and used Kagrenak's tools with the heart to turn themselves into living gods. Azura wasn't pleased and cursed the Chimer, turning them into the Dunmer, or Dark Elves, that we are familiar with. To the west of Tamriel, there lies another continent, Yokuda. About 100 years after the Second Battle of Red Mountain, much of Yokuda was lost when it sank into the ocean. Not like Aldmeris was allegedly lost. No, this definitely happened. The survivors sailed east and settled on Hurn, an uninhabited island off the coast of Hammerfell, where most of them stayed. A group of Yokudan warriors called the Regatta continued on to the mainland and claimed all they could, killing or enslaving the local beastfolk along the way. Regatta is the origin of Redguard, which would become the common name of Yokudans on Tamriel. After the Regatta drove off the local orcs, the Yokudan royalty left Hurn and made their place in Hammerfell. At first, the Redguards did not attempt to integrate themselves into Tamriel culture, maintaining their own language and refusing to trade with neighboring societies. Eventually, however, the Redguards and the Bretons found a common enemy in the Orsimer, and after a joint siege on the city of Orsinium, Hammerfell and High Rock began to openly trade with one another, which compelled the Redguards to adopt the common language and brought them into the fold of Tamrielic culture. So that about covers it. That is how all of the races we are most familiar with came to be and arrived at their respective regions throughout Tamriel. Many of the events I barreled through, like the fall of Orsinium, the toppling of the Aelids, and the disappearance of the Dwemer, have much more nuance and many more details than I have time for in this video. Trust me though, we'll get to these events and many more. Until then, thanks for watching.